The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried among thousands of other routine communications that flooded the human diplomatic channels. Ambassador Emma Knight almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another trade rejection or political snub from one of the major galactic powers. But something about the sender's designation made her pause. The Galactic Council was announcing the annual power rankings, a formal assessment of every species' military, economic, and political influence across the known galaxy. Emma opened the file with mild curiosity, scrolling through the familiar names at the top. The Krillian Empire held first place again, their advanced technology and ruthless efficiency keeping them ahead of their rivals. The Vorthan Federation claimed second with their vast trade networks and economic dominance. The hegemony of suns rounded out the top three, their massive military fleets securing their position through sheer force. Emma kept scrolling, past dozens of species she recognized from council meetings. The Altarians at rank 15, the Nexari at 23, the Thylorians at 31. She scrolled faster, looking for humanity's entry, 47, 53, 62. Her heart sank as she continued down the list. There it was, at rank 87 out of 93 recognized species. Humanity, Tier 7, minimal threat, limited strategic value. The same ranking they had held for the past 50 years since joining the Council. Emma stared at the screen in her small office aboard the human embassy station. Through the viewport she could see the massive structures of the Galactic Council headquarters, a sprawling complex of interconnected platforms and towers that housed representatives from across the galaxy. Human ships were dwarfed by the vessels of other species, their modest designs looking primitive next to the sleek Vorthan cruisers and intimidating Krillian dreadnoughts. Soft chime announced another message. This one was from Admiral Rick Stone, commander of Earth's Defense Forces. Emma opened it with growing dread. Emma, we've been denied docking rights at 3 more stations this week. The Krillians claim our ships don't meet their security standards. The Vorthans say our trade goods are inferior quality. Even the smaller species are starting to ignore our communications. We're becoming invisible out here. Emma closed the message and leaned back in her chair. She had dedicated her career to representing humanity on the galactic stage, believing that persistence and diplomacy would eventually earn them respect. But after decades of effort, they remained the galaxy's afterthought. The irony was bitter. Humanity had contributed more to galactic civilization than most species ranked above them. Human doctors had developed treatments for diseases that plagued dozens of worlds. Human engineers had designed more efficient star drives that were now used throughout the galaxy. Human diplomats had prevented 3 separate wars between minor powers through patient negotiation, but none of it mattered, because humanity lacked the one thing that truly counted in galactic politics: the ability to threaten others. Emma's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her assistant, David Ross. The young man looked troubled as he handed her a datapad. The latest refugee. Reports from the Outer Rim, he said. 3 more species have been displaced by the expansion of the major powers. The Krillians absorbed the Deltaran home system. The Vorthans have taken over the Quillan trade routes. The hegemony is forcing the Nexari to relocate their colonies. Emma scanned the reports with growing frustration. Each displaced species would petition the Council for protection, only to be told that their concerns were not a priority. The major powers would offer token assistance while continuing their slow expansion across the galaxy. What about us? David asked. Are we offering them sanctuary? Emma looked at the young man's hopeful expression and felt a familiar surge of pride in her species. Despite their low ranking, despite being ignored and dismissed, humans never hesitated to help others. It was a trait that baffled the major powers and earned them mockery from species that valued strength above all else. Send word to all human colonies, Emma said. We'll take in anyone who needs shelter. We may not have much, but we have room. David nodded and left to transmit the orders. Emma returned to her reports, but her mind wandered to the broader implications of humanity's situation. The galaxy was changing, and not for the better. The careful balance between the major powers was becoming increasingly unstable as each faction pushed for greater dominance. The Krillian Empire had spent centuries perfecting their military technology, creating weapons and ships that could overwhelm any opponent. Their society was built on the principle that might makes right, and they had little patience for species they considered weak. The Vorthan Federation controlled the flow of goods and information across the galaxy through their vast commercial networks. They believed that economic power was the ultimate weapon, and they used their wealth to influence smaller species while maintaining their position through careful manipulation. The hegemony of suns ruled through fear and intimidation, their massive fleets patrolling the core worlds to maintain order. They saw themselves as the galaxy's natural leaders, destined to bring civilization to the lesser species through force if necessary. All three powers viewed humanity as irrelevant, a minor species that had somehow stumbled into space travel but posed no threat to anyone who mattered. They were wrong about the threat part, but not in the way they might expect. Emma stood and walked to the viewport, watching the endless stream of ships moving through the space around the council headquarters. Somewhere in that traffic were the first refugees fleeing the Outer Rim, seeking sanctuary from the expanding influence of the major powers. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from weapons or wealth or fear, but from the simple willingness to help others when they need it most. And humanity, ignored and dismissed as they were, possessed that strength in abundance. Emma didn't know it yet, but the events set in motion by the major powers' expansion would soon change everything. The galaxy that had overlooked humanity for so long was about to discover just how wrong they had been about the species from the small blue planet on the Outer Rim. The war was coming, and when it arrived, the galaxy would need every strength it could find, even the ones they had never bothered to notice. The explosion echoed across the galaxy in the form of emergency broadcasts, coded transmissions, and the sudden mobilization of fleets that had been dormant for decades. Ambassador Thera of the Vorthan Federation was dead, vaporized along with her entire diplomatic vessel during what was supposed to be a routine trade negotiation with the Krillian Empire. Dr. Michael Torres was in his laboratory on Colony 7 when the first reports reached human space. The xenobiologist had been studying tissue samples from various refugee species when his assistant burst through the door with a communication device crackling with urgent transmissions. "Doctor, you need to hear this," Anna said, her face pale with shock. "The Vorthans are claiming the Krillians assassinated their ambassador. The Krillians are denying it and accusing the hegemony of staging the attack, and the hegemony is saying both sides are lying." Michael listened to the cascading reports with growing horror. Within hours, the three major powers had recalled their ambassadors from each other's territories. Trade agreements were suspended. Military fleets began moving toward strategic positions. The careful balance that had maintained galactic peace for centuries was crumbling in real time. "This is War Marshal Corex of the Krillian Empire," a harsh voice announced over the emergency channels. "The cowardly attack on our diplomatic mission will not go unanswered. We will defend ourselves against Vorthan aggression with the full might of our military forces." The response came immediately from Chancellor Thyra's replacement. "The Vorthan Federation categorically denies any involvement in this tragedy. We call upon all peaceful species to recognize this transparent attempt by the Krillians to justify their planned expansion into our territory." Before either side could respond, Supreme Commander Drex of the Hegemony added his voice to the chaos. "The Hegemony of Suns has evidence that both the Krillian Empire and Vorthan Federation have been planning this conflict for years. We will not allow their war to threaten the stability of the core worlds." Michael turned off the communication device and looked at Anna. "Contact Ambassador Knight immediately. Tell her we need to prepare for refugees, a lot of them." The young woman nodded and rushed out, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. He had spent his career studying the biology of different species, learning about their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and hopes, but he had never imagined he would witness the collapse of galactic civilization. The war began in earnest. 3 days later, the first battle took place in the Corin system, where Krillian and Vorthan fleets clashed in a massive engagement that lasted 18 hours. The Krillians deployed their new plasma torpedoes, weapons that could punch through any known defensive system. The Vorthans responded with their quantum mines, devices that could destabilize the fabric of space itself. Both sides claimed victory, but the battle left thousands of ships destroyed and entire worlds caught in the crossfire. The Corin system's inhabitants, a peaceful species called the Malari, watched helplessly as their home became a battlefield. The hegemony entered the conflict 2 days later, launching surprise attacks on both Krillian and Vorthan border worlds. Their massive dreadnoughts swept through poorly defended systems, claiming they were establishing buffer zones to protect neutral species from the expanding war. Within a week, the conflict had spread to 50 star systems. Ancient alliances crumbled as smaller species were forced to choose sides or face annihilation. The Altarians joined the Krillians, hoping their loyalty would protect their homeworld. The Nexari sided with the Vorthans, believing their trade relationships would ensure their survival. The Thylorians declared for the hegemony. Seeking the protection of their powerful fleets, other species simply fled, loading their populations onto transport ships and heading for the outer rim where they hoped to find safety. The stream of refugees that had been a trickle became a flood. With millions of beings seeking sanctuary from the spreading violence, Michael found himself overwhelmed by the diversity of refugees arriving at human colonies. Species he had only read about in textbooks were now living in hastily constructed camps, their entire civilizations reduced to whatever they could carry on their ships. "We're receiving 50,000 Quailon refugees at Colony 12, reported Administrator Diana Hayes during the daily briefing. They're badly injured from Vorthan bombardment of their homeworld. Our medical facilities are already overcrowded." "What about Colony 3? Asked Governor Patricia Mills. "They took in 30,000 Deltaron refugees last week." "Stretched to the breaking point," Diana replied. "But they're managing. The Deltarans are helping with food production, and they've set up schools for the children." Michael listened to the reports with a mixture of pride and concern. The human colonies were straining under the burden of refugees, but they were finding ways to cope. More importantly, they were treating every refugee with dignity and respect, regardless of their species or origin. This was not how the major powers operated. The Krillians used refugees as labor for their war machine. The Vorthans saw them as economic resources to be exploited. The hegemony simply turned them away, claiming they lacked the resources to help. But humanity, ranked 87th in galactic power, was somehow managing to house, feed, and care for millions of beings from across the galaxy. They were doing it not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. The war continued to escalate with each passing day. The Krillians deployed new weapons that could sterilize entire planets. The Vorthans unleashed economic warfare that crashed the currencies of neutral worlds. The hegemony began forced conscription of any species within their territory. Reports filtered in from across the galaxy of atrocities committed by all sides. Cities burned. Populations were enslaved. Ancient cultural sites were destroyed in orbital bombardments. The civilization that had taken millennia to build was being torn apart in a matter of weeks. Yet in the small corner of space claimed by humanity, something different was happening. The refugees weren't just surviving, they were beginning to thrive. Human adaptability and their inexplicable willingness to help others had created pockets of stability in a galaxy gone mad. Michael was working late in his laboratory when the message arrived. It was from a colleague on Earth, Dr. Emma Stone, who had been monitoring the galactic situation from the human homeworld. "Michael, we're getting reports that the major powers are starting to notice what we're doing out there. The Krillians are calling our refugee camps strategic assets. The Vorthans want to establish trade agreements with the refugee populations. The hegemony is demanding we turn over any refugees from species they consider hostile." Michael stared at the message with growing unease. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's major powers were paying attention to humanity. The question was whether that attention would prove to be a blessing or a curse. Outside his laboratory window, Michael could see the lights of the refugee camps stretching to the horizon. Millions of beings who had lost everything. Now, depending on a species that the galaxy had dismissed as insignificant, the war was far from over. And Michael suspected that humanity was about to discover that sometimes being noticed by the powerful was more dangerous than being ignored. The refugee ship appeared on the outer sensors of Earth's orbital defense grid at 0347 hours, its hull scarred by weapon burns and its distress signal barely functional. Lieutenant Commander Alex Rivera was monitoring the night shift when the alerts began flashing across his screen. Control, this is the Altarian vessel Hope's End requesting immediate sanctuary. The transmission crackled with interference. We have 12,000 civilians aboard, including wounded from the Krillian assault on Altair Prime. Alex stared at the sensor readings in disbelief. Altair Prime had been one of the strongest worlds in the Altarian Republic, a fortress system that was supposed to be impregnable. If it had fallen to the Krillians, then the war had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. Hope's End, this is Earth Control, Alex replied. You are cleared for emergency approach to Station 7. Medical teams are standing by. The ship that limped toward Earth's orbital facilities was a heartbreaking sight. Once a proud passenger liner, it had been converted into a refugee transport, with additional life support systems welded to its hull. Alex could see the scorch marks where Krillian plasma weapons had nearly breached the ship's defenses within hours. The first refugees were being processed through the station's medical facilities. Alex watched through the observation windows as human doctors worked alongside Altarian medical staff to treat the wounded. The scene was chaotic but organized, with volunteers from across the human colonies arriving to help manage the influx. Commander Rivera, a voice called behind him. Alex turned to see Admiral Patricia Hayes, Earth's defense coordinator, approaching with a grim expression. We need to talk. They walked to a private briefing room where Hayes activated a holographic display showing the current state of the galaxy. Red zones marked areas of active conflict, while yellow indicators showed systems under threat. The amount of red was staggering. The Krillians have taken the Altarian home system, Hayes began. But that's not the worst of it. Intelligence? Reports suggest they're planning to push further into the outer rim. The Vorthans are retreating from their forward positions, and the hegemony is consolidating their forces around the core worlds. Alex studied the display with growing concern. What does this mean for us? It means the war is coming to human space whether we want it or not, Hayes replied. We're sitting on 17 colonies full of refugees from across the galaxy. The major powers are starting to see that as either a threat or an opportunity. The implications were clear. Earth's policy of offering sanctuary to anyone fleeing the war had made them a target. The refugees represented potential intelligence, assets, skilled workers, and in some cases, strategic resources that the warring factions wanted to control. There's more, Hayes continued. We've received formal communications from all three major powers. They're demanding access to the refugee populations in our territory. Alex felt a chill of premonition. What kind of access? The Krillians want to interrogate any refugees from species they consider hostile. The Vorthans want to establish trade agreements with refugee communities. The hegemony is demanding we turn over any refugees who might have strategic information about their enemies. The requests were barely disguised attempts to violate human sovereignty. Each major power was trying to use Earth's refugee camps as a way to gain advantage in the war. What did we tell them? Alex asked. Hayes smiled grimly. We told them all the same thing. The refugees are under human protection, and we don't negotiate with anyone who threatens civilian populations. It was a brave response, but Alex knew it was also dangerous. Humanity might be willing to stand up to the major powers, but they lacked the military strength to back up their words if pushed too far. Over the following weeks, the situation continued to deteriorate. More refugee ships arrived daily, each one carrying survivors from worlds that had been consumed by the expanding war. The human colonies strained under the burden, but they adapted with characteristic resilience. Colony 12 converted its mining facilities into refugee housing. Colony 7 established schools for displaced children from dozens of species. Colony 3 organized work programs that allowed refugees to contribute to their own support while learning human techniques for agriculture and manufacturing. Dr. Emma Stone, now serving as Earth's refugee coordinator, found herself managing a population that had grown from 12 billion to over 20 billion beings. The logistics were staggering, but somehow they were making it work. "We're housing 4 million Nexari refugees on Colony 15, she reported during the daily briefing. They've established their own governing council and are helping with food production. The Quillan refugees on Colony 8 have set up workshops producing medical supplies. The Thylorians on Colony 2 are teaching their engineering techniques to human students." What struck Emma most was how quickly the refugees had adapted to life alongside humans. Despite their different biologies, cultures, and histories, they were finding ways to work together that surprised even the most optimistic observers. The major powers, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly frustrated with humanity's refusal to cooperate. The Krillians had begun patrolling the edges of human space, their warships making aggressive displays of force. The Vorthans had cut off all trade with human colonies, hoping to pressure them through economic isolation. The hegemony had declared human space a zone of strategic concern and was demanding inspection rights. Emma was reviewing the latest diplomatic protests when the emergency alert sounded. She rushed to the command center where Admiral Hayes was coordinating with the orbital defense platforms. "What's happening?" Emma asked. "Krillian fleet movements near Colony 6, Hayes replied. 3 heavy cruisers and a dreadnought. They're demanding we surrender all Vorthan refugees in our territory." Emma felt her heart sink. Colony 6 housed nearly 2 million refugees, including a large population of Vorthan civilians who had fled their homeworld when the war began. The Krillians obviously wanted to use them as leverage against their enemies. "Our response?" Emma asked. Hayes looked at her with steel in her eyes. "The same as always. The refugees are under human protection." The standoff lasted for 6 hours. The Krillian fleet held position at the edge of Colony 6's defensive perimeter while human ships moved to intercept. The entire galaxy watched as the previously ignored species faced down one of the most powerful military forces in known space. Finally, the Krillians withdrew, but not before transmitting a message that chilled Emma to the bone. "This is War Marshal Corex of the Krillian Empire. Your protection of enemy populations is an act of war. We will not tolerate continued interference in galactic affairs." Similar confrontations occurred with the Vorthans and the hegemony over the following days. Each time, humanity stood firm, protecting the refugees regardless of their species or origin. But each incident brought them closer to a direct conflict they couldn't hope to win. Dudeva stood on the observation deck of Earth's primary orbital station, looking out at the stream of ships moving through the system. Human vessels worked alongside refugee craft from dozens of species, all united by the simple principle that everyone deserved protection from the horrors of war. The galaxy had ignored humanity for so long that they had forgotten a fundamental truth about the species from the small blue planet. When pushed to the wall, when faced with impossible choices, humans didn't back down. They stood their ground and found ways to do what was right, even when it seemed impossible. The war was coming to human space, and Emma knew that everything they had built over the past months was about to be tested. But looking at the cooperation between species who had never worked together before, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, humanity's stubborn refusal to abandon those who needed help would prove to be their greatest strength. When the darkness finally arrived at their doorstep, the emergency signal reached Earth at 11:47 hours on a Thursday morning, transmitted on frequencies that hadn't been used in over 2 centuries. Dr. Emma Stone was in her office, reviewing refugee placement reports when her assistant burst through the door, her face white with terror. "Doctor, you need to see this immediately," Anna said, activating the holographic display. It's from the Galactic Council's emergency broadcast system. The image that appeared showed Supreme Commander Drex of the Hegemony, but he looked nothing like the proud military leader who had dominated galactic politics for decades. His uniform was torn, his multiple eyes showed signs of exhaustion, and his voice carried a note of desperation that Emma had never heard before. "This is an emergency transmission to all surviving civilizations," Drex began. "The Hegemony of Suns has inadvertently released an ancient weapon system known as the Void Devourers. These machines are consuming matter at an exponential rate and cannot be stopped by conventional means. I repeat, we have lost control of the Void Devourers." Emma felt her blood turn to ice. She had read about the Void Devourers in classified historical documents, ancient weapons that had been banned by galactic treaty for good reason. The machines were designed to consume matter and convert it into energy to fuel their own replication, creating a cascade effect that could theoretically consume entire star systems. Current projections indicate the devices will reach inhabited systems within 72 hours, Drex continued. The Hegemony's homeworld of Solus Prime has already been completely consumed. We are evacuating all remaining populations to the Outer Rim and requesting immediate assistance from any species with advanced research capabilities. The transmission ended, leaving Emma staring at the empty hologram in stunned silence. The galaxy's most powerful military force had just admitted. They had unleashed something that could destroy everything within minutes. Similar messages arrived from the Krillian Empire and the Vorthan Federation. Both powers had suffered devastating losses to the Void Devourers and were requesting assistance from anyone who might have a solution. Emma was still processing the implications when Admiral Hayes arrived with a team of Earth's top scientists and military advisors. The group gathered in the Emergency Command Center as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. "The Krillian homeworld is gone," reported Dr. Michael Torres, who had been monitoring the situation from Colony 7. 5 billion beings, just ... erased. The machines converted the entire planet into raw energy in less than 6 hours. The Vorthan trade hub at Nexus Station suffered the same fate, added Dr. David Miller, Earth's chief physicist. The machines seem to be following established trade routes, consuming everything in their path. Admiral Hayes activated the tactical display, showing the current spread of the Void Devourers across the galaxy. The red zones were expanding rapidly, already encompassing the former territories of all three major powers. At their current rate of expansion, they'll reach human space within the week, Hayes said grimly. We need solutions, and we need them fast. Emma looked around the room at the assembled experts. For the first time in galactic history, the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy were turning to humanity for help. The species they had dismissed as insignificant was now their only hope for survival. What do we know about these machines? Emma asked. Dr. Torres pulled up the available data. They're self-replicating nanotechnology, designed to break down matter at the molecular level. Each machine can create hundreds of copies of itself using the material it consumes. They're virtually indestructible by conventional weapons because they can simply absorb the energy and use it to replicate faster. But they must have a weakness, Emma insisted. Nothing is perfect, Dr. Miller nodded slowly. The original research indicates they have trouble processing certain types of complex organic compounds. But the specifics were classified at the highest levels. We'd need access to the original research data. As if summoned by their conversation, a new transmission arrived. This one showed War Marshal Corex of the Krillian Empire and Chancellor Thera of the Vorthan Federation, both looking as desperate as Supreme Commander Drex had appeared. People of Earth, Corex began, his usual arrogance replaced by naked desperation. We formally request your assistance in stopping the Void Devourers. We will provide any information you need, including classified research data from the original weapons program. Chancellor Thera stepped forward. The Vorthan Federation offers complete access to our quantum research facilities and our most advanced computational systems. We know we have given you little reason to help us, but we are begging you to try. The transmission ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. Emma realized that in the space of a few hours, the entire balance of galactic power had shifted. The three great powers were no longer demanding anything from humanity, they were begging. "We need to contact our refugee populations," Emma said finally. "Many of them are scientists and engineers from these civilizations. They might have information. We need..." The next 72 hours were a blur of activity unlike anything in human history. Research teams from Earth worked alongside refugee scientists from dozens of species, sharing information and expertise that had been jealously guarded for centuries. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Lisa Park, a human xenobiologist who had been studying the unique brain chemistry of different species, noticed something unusual in the neural patterns of certain refugees. The void devourers are programmed to avoid complex quantum-entangled particles, she explained to the combined research team. These particles exist naturally in the neural tissue of most organic species, but they can be artificially synthesized and concentrated. "So we create a quantum disruption field?" asked Dr. Torres. "Exactly. If we can generate enough of these particles and deploy them at key points in the machine's replication network, we should be able to create a cascade failure that stops their spread." The theory was brilliant, but the execution would be nearly impossible. The quantum particles had to be synthesized in massive quantities and deployed with precise timing across multiple star systems. It would require coordination between species that had been trying to kill each other just days before. Emma found herself at the center of the most complex operation in galactic history. Human ships, previously dismissed as primitive, became the key to the plan. Their smaller size and adaptability allowed them to navigate the quantum storms that surrounded the void devourers. Carrying their precious cargo to the critical deployment points, the operation began with a coordinated strike on the machine's primary replication centers. Human ships, accompanied by vessels from the refugee populations, dove through the chaotic energy fields that surrounded the void devourers. Many ships were lost, their crews vaporized by the machine's defensive systems, but the survivors pressed on, delivering their quantum charges to the exact coordinates calculated by the combined research teams. As each charge detonated, the machine's replication network began to falter. Emma watched from the command center as the tide of destruction finally began to slow. The red zones on the tactical display stopped expanding. Then, gradually, they began to shrink as the void devourers' cascade failure spread through their network. "It's working," Dr. Torres reported, his voice filled with amazement. "The machines are shutting down across the entire affected region." The operation succeeded, but the cost was staggering. Entire sectors of the galaxy had been consumed, including the homeworlds of all three major powers. Trillions of beings had died, and the survivors were scattered across the outer rim dot as the dust settled. Emma realized that the galaxy would never be the same. The old order was gone, destroyed by the very weapons that had once given the major powers their strength. In its place was something new, something that had emerged from the cooperation between species that had never worked together before. The refugees who had found sanctuary in human space were no longer just survivors. They were the foundation of a new civilization, one built on the principles of cooperation and mutual aid that humanity had demonstrated during the crisis. Emma stood on the observation deck of Earth's orbital station, watching the ships moving through the system. They were no longer divided by species or origin, but united by the shared experience of survival. The galaxy had been tested by fire, and those who remained had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from weapons or power, but from the willingness to help others when everything seems lost. The test was over, but the real work was just beginning. The Great Assembly Hall in New Geneva had been hastily expanded to accommodate representatives from over 400 species, making it the largest gathering of galactic civilizations in recorded history. Ambassador Emma Knight adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform and looked out at the sea of beings who had come to Earth to forge a new future from the ashes of the old. Galaxy. 6 months had passed since the void devours had been stopped, and the survivors were finally ready to talk about what came next. The ancient seats of power lay in ruins, their mighty fleets scattered, their populations reduced to refugees seeking shelter wherever they could find it. But from this tragedy had emerged something unprecedented, a chance to build something better. Emma walked to the podium at the center of the hall, aware that every eye, sensor, and recording device in the room was focused on her. She had never imagined that she would one day address the remnants of galactic civilization, but the crisis had changed everything. "Representatives of the galaxy," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems that allowed hundreds of species to understand each other. "We gather not as conquerors or conquered, but as survivors. We have all lost something in this war, but we have also learned something valuable about ourselves and each other." In the front row, she could see the former leaders of the major powers. War Marshal Korex of the Krillian Empire looked diminished without his massive fleets to back up his words. Chancellor Thyra of the Vorthan Federation sat quietly, her commercial empire reduced to a few trading posts on the outer rim. Supreme Commander Drex of the Hegemony stared at the floor, the weight of his responsibility for the disaster clearly visible on his alien features. "The old ways failed us," Emma continued. "We built our civilizations on the assumption that strength came from the ability to dominate others. We measured success by how much territory we controlled, how many weapons we possessed, how much fear we could inspire. But when the real crisis came, none of that mattered." She gestured to the mixed crowd of beings filling the hall. "What saved us was not the strongest fleet or the most advanced technology. It was the willingness of ordinary people to help each other, to share what they had, to work together despite their differences. It was the recognition that we are all part of something larger than ourselves." The applause that followed was subdued but genuine. Emma could see nods of agreement from representatives who had witnessed the cooperation that had emerged during the crisis. Species that had been enemies for centuries had worked side by side to develop the solution that stopped the void devourers. "That is why we propose the establishment of the new Galactic Council," Emma announced. "Not as a forum for the powerful to dominate the weak, but as a true democracy where every species has a voice, regardless of their military strength or economic influence." The response was immediate and varied. Some representatives cheered. Others looked skeptical, and a few appeared genuinely confused by the concept. The idea of a galactic government based on equality rather than power was revolutionary. Dr. Michael Torres, now serving as Earth Science Advisor, stood to address the Assembly. "The crisis showed us that diversity is our greatest strength. The solution to the void devourers came not from any single species, but from the combination of knowledge and perspectives from across the galaxy. We are stronger together than we ever were apart." Over the following days, the delegates worked to hammer out the details of the new galactic charter. The discussions were heated, with many species struggling to accept the idea that they would have equal voice with civilizations they had previously considered inferior. The breakthrough came when Dr. Lisa Park presented the refugee integration reports. "In the past 6 months, we have seen something remarkable," she told the Assembly. "The refugee populations in human space have not just survived, they have thrived. They have created new technologies, new art forms, new ways of thinking that none of us could have imagined alone." She activated a holographic display showing the refugee colonies. Colony 7 now produces the most advanced medical treatments in the galaxy, developed by human doctors working with Altarian healers and Mexari biochemists. Colony 12 has created sustainable agriculture systems that can feed billions, combining Vorthan efficiency with Thylorian innovation and human adaptability. The images showed bustling communities where beings from dozens of species lived and worked together. Children of different species played together in schools that taught the best of all their cultures. Adults collaborated on projects that would have been impossible for any single species to complete alone. "This is our future," Dr. Park concluded. "Not the domination of one species over others, but the cooperation of all species for the benefit of everyone. The turning point came when War Marshal Korex stood to address the assembly. The proud Krillian leader looked older than his years, his military bearing diminished by the weight of recent events. "I have spent my life believing that strength came from the ability to defeat others," he said slowly. "I built the greatest military force in galactic history, and it was useless when we needed it most. But these humans, whom we dismissed as weak, saved us all through the strength we never understood." He turned to face Emma directly. "You showed us that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the willingness to protect. Not from taking what others have, but from sharing what you have. We called you insignificant, but you proved that significance comes not from size or strength, but from character." Chancellor Thyra rose next, her membrane wings fluttering with emotion. "The Vorthan Federation controlled trade across the galaxy, but we never created anything truly valuable. We moved goods from one place to another and took profit from the exchange. But here, in these refugee colonies, we see real creation, real innovation, real progress." She gestured to the holographic displays. "Our economists have studied the refugee communities, and they are achieving productivity levels that should be impossible. They are doing it because they are working together instead of competing against each other, because they share their successes instead of hoarding them." The final speech came from Supreme Commander Drex, and it was the most difficult to hear. The former hegemony leader's voice was barely above a whisper as he described the weight of his responsibility for unleashing the Void Devourers. "I destroyed the galaxy because I believed that force was the answer to every problem," he said. "I thought that if we could just impose order through strength, we could create peace. Instead, I created the greatest disaster in galactic history." He looked around the assembly with haunted eyes. "The humans could have turned us away when we came begging for help. They could have let us face the consequences of our actions alone. Instead, they worked day and night to save us, even knowing that we had treated them as enemies. That is a strength I never possessed, and one I hope to learn." The vote on the new galactic charter was unanimous. Every species represented in the assembly agreed to join the new Galactic Council, with Earth serving as the capital world. The refugee colonies would become the first integrated communities in galactic history, serving as models for the peaceful cooperation that would define the new order. Emma stood once again at the podium as the signing ceremony concluded. Around her, representatives from across the galaxy were mingling freely, sharing stories and ideas that would have been unthinkable just months before. "Today we begin a new chapter in galactic history," she announced. "Not the history of conquest and domination, but the history of cooperation and mutual respect. We have learned that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. That helping others helps ourselves. That the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from turning them into friends." The celebration that followed lasted for 3 days, with beings from hundreds of species sharing their cultures, their foods, their music, and their dreams for the future. Earth cities filled with visitors who had come not as conquerors or traders, but as partners in building something better. Dr. Torres found Emma on the observation deck of the orbital station on the final night of the celebration. Below them, the lights of Earth twinkled like stars, while above them, the ships of the new galactic community moved in peaceful formation. "Do you think it will last?" he asked. "This new cooperation we've built?" Emma considered the question carefully. "The old system lasted for centuries because it was based on fear. Fear of being conquered, fear of being left behind, fear of change. But fear always breaks down eventually because it divides us instead of uniting us." She gestured to the scene below them. "This is based on something stronger. It's based on the recognition that we all have something to offer and that we all have something to gain from working together. That's not something that breaks down over time. It's something that grows stronger." As if to prove her point, a group of children from the refugee colonies could be seen playing in one of Earth's parks, their different forms and abilities complementing each other in games that none of their species could have invented alone. "Besides," Emma added with a smile, We humans are stubborn about helping others. Even if some species decide they want to go back to the old ways, we'll keep working to bring them back into the community. That's just who we are. The galaxy had been tested by fire and emerged transformed. The species that had once been ignored and dismissed now stood at the center of a new civilization, built on the principles they had quietly demonstrated for centuries. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy through force or cunning, but through the simple act of being there when others needed help. As the celebration continued below and the ships of the new galactic community moved through the space around Earth, Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The galaxy was finally ready to learn what humanity had always known, that true strength comes not from standing above others, but from standing beside them. The age of cooperation had begun, and the universe would never be the same.